for Apple comes down to switching costs. When you use your iPhone, you're using an Apple device and it has iOS, but you're spending almost all of your time inside of a Meta-owned property. And so Apple may own the OS, but Facebook owns the user experience. Facebook owns the engagement. Now, if the games were built into their platform and they could monetize, who would bother with the App Store? And so this app ecosystem that has created a lot of lock-in for Apple, it's about more than payments, right? It's their differentiation.
What's up, guys? It's Justin, back at it again. We're doing another podcast. Welcome to Secret Stash, my podcast. I'm the co-founder of Stash, and here I've got my co-host, Archie Stonehill.
Hey everyone, very excited to be back, and got another great Justin joining us this time.
We've got Justin Waldron, special guest I've known for a long time from my time in Silicon Valley. He's the co-founder of Zynga. Back in 2007, he co-founded Zynga at the age of 19, which was the first social gaming company. And Justin led product there for a couple of years through the IPO in 2011. Then in 2020, co-founded Playco, which is a social instant gaming company. Like many of our guests, he's also an active investor and has invested in over 100 startups. So Justin, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So today we're going to talk about Justin's journey at Zynga, and in particular how Zynga navigated some of the shifting platform dynamics, and then how that has fed into Justin's work since then, both as an investor and then also with his most recent work at Playco.
All right, so let's kick it off with Zynga. Like, not everybody starts a company at 19. Tell us the story of how you met Pincus and how you got involved with that.
Yeah, so I grew up on the internet, and I grew up in that era of Web 2.0 sort of social networking kicking off. So when MySpace was sort of like the place to be, I was right in the prime demographic for MySpace. And when I hit Facebook age, right at 19, it was when they just opened up outside of to the broader university landscape. And so for me, like, I was always there right when these platforms were getting popular. Grew up on AOL Instant Messenger, spent a lot of time in chat rooms and growing up in internet culture back when that's what this was. And on MySpace, I was, modifying my page. That's what people did, right? You can insert your own JavaScript, your own HTML, and it was sort of like this world where there were no APIs, but you could build what you want and your friends could see it instantly, and they never had to download anything. So while I was also interested in programming more generally, I was making these Visual Basic stuff and, C++ in my teens. It was really hard to get anybody to install anything on Windows. And I started to realize right away, this is really cool. On the internet, like, if I have a page and I put something in it, then people show up and it just works, right? So I think that stuck with me. And when I saw Facebook actually release something where they wanted people to do this, and it wasn't sort of like an accidental feature, I got really excited about it. So the first day the Facebook platform came out, I put out an app. And so it was, launch partners and then me and a few other people, college students who just built some apps right when they released. And the app was basically a simple app that let you connect with your friends to play games together on the Nintendo Wii. So the Nintendo Wii had this number code system, and it was almost like a phone number. But I realized none of my friends were sharing them because it was too much of a pain. So it was really simple. You just put in your number and then it would tell you what all your friends' numbers were. It's just a database so you could learn what your friends' Wii numbers were so you could actually play with them. And it's kind of funny looking back at it because that's really like the direction we went with Zynga, was all about helping people play games with their friends. But got excited about it, like saw the potential, didn't know exactly what I wanted to build on it, but was in this area of entertainment games and letting people play together. Mark reached out on Facebook literally through a message. So and remotely. And actually we worked together. The whole team at Zynga worked together remotely for the first 3-4 months. We got profitable remotely. And then we decided everybody should move to the city. And that's when things really kicked off after the summer. So I was in my freshman break in the summer. We built Zynga Poker. That was the first game. I was the main developer, product person on that. And then it evolved into, before the end of the summer, hey, like, I should take some time off. I should go do this full time. We can maybe make a company out of this. And what started as a sort of simple experiment saying, hey, college kids love poker. Why don't we figure out a way to put that into Facebook? Because there's a lot of college students there, turned into something that was, we immediately realized, oh, okay, what we're doing with this poker game and the way these people are connecting could be applied to pretty much any game. And then we sort of said, this should be a company.
So you got profitable in 3 or 4 months while you were still remote. That's crazy.
Yeah. We got profitable quickly, and it wasn't on the business model that we ended up really popularizing, which is this freemium virtual goods business model that everybody's using now in games. It was actually a poker app, right? And so we could sell ads for paid poker sites, which were pretty popular at that point. So we actually had a pretty good way of monetizing right off the bat. And luckily enough, we didn't get stuck with that model, and we never stopped experimenting, because there was probably another history there where, we, instead of starting to sell poker chips and seeing the larger potential, we just stayed stuck on affiliate revenue with poker sites, because that was a really big revenue source back then. But yeah, we were lucky to have things working right from the get-go.
And people often find the notion of social casino really unintuitive and weird, which I get, right? Because you can't cash out. And so, for viewers who don't know, gambling is defined as money in, like game of chance, and then money out, cash in, consideration, money out. And so, big gambling's never been about making money because the house always wins. And so I'm really curious, both in the context of that moment in time where you were seeing the emergence of platforms like Facebook, and your kind of insight into the various real money dynamics that were kind of happening in the American online gambling. Like, what was it about poker that made it your first product that you built?
Yeah, actually, so we noticed that there was an empty space on the social platforms. So you had a lot of people, and they were looking for something to do. And at that time on Facebook, you could poke each other back and forth. You could leave a message on somebody's wall, but there wasn't really that much to do. And people were so amazed by the people that were there. They would just go to someone's profile and look through their photos over and over again, because there wasn't enough actual content to do anything. And so we were saying, okay, this is like a cocktail party, right? Like, what is the thing that people can do that breaks the ice and actually makes conversation start? And poker is exactly that, right? People have conversations at the poker table. It was a very, very natural fit for that. And interestingly, like you talked about, like, social casino is a little counterintuitive, and there were free poker websites on the internet at that point. There were a lot of them. Poker was huge in 2007. The World Series of Poker was really having a moment, especially like with college age people. It was probably at its peak in popularity, at least in terms of penetration. It felt like everybody was playing poker back then. And the single thing that I noticed was that actually on these poker sites that people were playing, like Poker Stars and other poker clients, they had free poker chips, and you could play a free game, but no one was really playing them. And I think a big part of it was, like, they weren't interested in interacting with the people around them. There wasn't enough social context. And to understand, like, the motivation behind why people were doing this, it's not about just cashing out. Even cash players sit down with friends and strangers in part, like, enjoy the social interaction and the thrill of winning a hand, whether there's real money involved or not. And so I think what we did was just realize that earlier than a lot of other people, and then lean into the social interactions like crazy. So right away, we had these features to send gifts across the table and stuff. And they were just ways of flexing. And now this is, I mean, in live streams now, you send, like, a gift to someone in the live stream. We were doing that on a live poker game 16 years ago. And it was huge. People hadn't seen anything like that before. There was no ability for you to send some ridiculous flamingo across the table and any of these other poker clients. It was like a brand new sort of thing. And we realized that that's actually what people wanted. So, and that type of gameplay and that philosophy could be applied across many, many more games. And so the real story of Zynga is, it's not just about playing games with friends. There's actually a tech revolution that happened in the background. There's a business model revolution. There were a number of things that kind of all happened simultaneously. And the first one was you could play these games inside the browser. And before that, all these poker clients were downloadable clients on the PC. So what people don't realize is, like, this Zynga poker client inside of Facebook was literally the first experience most people ever had with a fully functional poker client that they just hit a page and it loaded up. So Flash had been around for a while, but people were building really simple games. They weren't building something where you, with a whole client server model with like saved state and user accounts and these entire ecosystems. And a big part of it was because, well, it costs like more money and time to build those things. And so Flash was sort of this over the weekend indie hacker type of game environment. It wasn't something where people had enough money to go build teams and go build big games. And so once we figured out the business model and we could reinvest the money back into building bigger and better games, you saw Flash start to get pushed to its limits. And this technology that may have been out for a little bit before then started to actually show what it could really do. And people just never had experiences like this inside of a web page before.
Both of you, I think, founded businesses that were like enabled by a moment in time in technology, both in the browser. And I think now you have a lot of discussion about the kind of return of the browser as a distribution environment for games, for stuff like WebGPU. Unity's investing heavily in their browser support models. And then obviously what we do at Stash is a lot about using the browsers to disintermediate the platform ecosystems that have kind of gotten in the way of developers and their players. So I'm interested in, like, was it a technology unlock specifically that enabled this browser environment? Was it a distribution unlock in that Facebook allowed social integration of existing social systems? Like, what about that moment in time enabled this specific product to take off when it did?
Yeah, I think it was multiple things in combination. So the browser environment enabled Facebook, right? If you think about it, what Web 2.0 in large part was, people don't talk about it much anymore, but it was a lot of the apps that we use on our desktop moving to the browser. And Facebook never started off as a desktop app. And so that was part of that cohort where people said, wow, you can build actual interactive apps on the internet. It sort of kicked off with Gmail. And I know Justin remembers this when he was working on his calendaring startup. People were really excited about a web page where you could actually interact with it. And it wasn't a page, but more of an app, right? And so that inevitably was going to go to games, right? They were just sort of the more difficult, more time-consuming version of this, more expensive. And that's really what we did, was just see it through to its conclusion, where it was like, okay, well, if all these apps mean that then it's like more of a SaaS model where people are paying to use the apps in some form via ads or some other form, like, what does that mean for games? What does it mean if games have an internet-native business model? And what we saw before that was there were a lot of sites where people were playing games. There was like addictinggames.com and Newgrounds and these places where people would play these little Flash games. But they were stuck on a business model that didn't allow them to actually scale it. And so the way they scaled their business is just by having lots of different games. And every individual developer would make a very small amount of money. So you'd have a bunch of sort of independent freelance indie devs making stuff on the weekends. They were hosted by another company, so there was like no server client interaction. You know, these people had to deliver a game that just slotted into this website. It wasn't like they were going to be running some MMO server on the back or connecting to a database. These were just sort of single player experiences. And so the business model affected the what the games could actually be. Like, you didn't go back to Newgrounds to play another session and another session of a continuing game. And Newgrounds was just wanting to spread you around the different games that they were publishing. And so no one had really figured out, like, what is a game that tries to keep its customers and monetize those customers in the web. We did start seeing it happen outside of the web. You had stuff like World of Warcraft that was really taking off the few years prior to this. And it became very clear through sort of MMOs, where they kind of led the way in terms of like what a service-oriented gaming business could be. But they really missed the boat on freemium. So
I was thinking
they did
RuneScape.
not understand freemium. Yeah, RuneScape. Yeah, RuneScape, exactly. So that was the key difference, is a lot of those were subscription based, which it's funny now to see, a big sort of return to subscription businesses later. It's what's old is new again always. But I think that they didn't realize the demand for the currency and the items in the game at that point, but you could see it happening. You could see people farming gold in World of Warcraft. And the same people that were farming gold in World of Warcraft were taking poker chips in Zynga Poker and selling them on eBay. So we saw this stuff happening organically, and then we said, well, there's a ton of demand for this. If they're going to sell it on eBay, we should probably just sell it ourselves, right? And that's kind of how it started.
So it was organic behavior beforehand, in terms of you saw emergent behavior of people selling poker chips, and then the light bulb went off, and we're like, hey, we should be selling the poker chips.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, at that time, what that meant was doing a lot of payments in house, right? So
Yeah.
it wasn't a small thing to get done. There was no Stripe. I think PayPal didn't work with virtual goods at that point. It was meant for like, you know, selling stuff on eBay. So we were working with credit card processors that were basically built for adult video sites, and like figuring out how to make them work, you know, for what we were doing. We had to build a 20-person in-house payments team. So it was really the early days.
The writing was there on the wall in a way, because I was, you know, was a user of a player in the first MMO, Ultima Online. It's like probably my favorite game ever. And that was almost a decade before. And I remember what you were saying, people were selling the stuff in the game. Like they charged, I think, $10 or $15 a month to play this game. And so I like begged my parents to pay for it basically on playing this game. But then the houses, because they didn't account for as many players as there would be, like all the available land for houses got taken. So then these houses were reselling on eBay for like hundreds of dollars, you know, much to the bewilderment of like every adult who heard about this. You know, I think it was written up in the Wall Street Journal or something. But, you know, the light bulb didn't go off. I was like, hey, we should just let people play for free and just start selling these houses, you know, which they could have thought of at any time.
Yeah, exactly. And the weird thing was it was seen as such a like niche thing, right? It was these MMO guys are over here, these World of Warcraft shut-ins. It was like a constant media sort of conversation where it was like gamers had become a term around the mid 2000s, and it wasn't like a positive term. It was something that like parents were not happy about, and people could not relate to the people spending all day playing World of Warcraft. And in many ways, like they were blindsided by what was to come because these people were kind of living in the future.
Yeah. Free-to-play games, Archie, to go back to your question, like, I mean, I want to say the first ones, I mean, in a way, these addicting games were, I guess they were free, but they weren't like free to play in the same sense of like, we monetize you afterwards. It was just like these supported business models, which were obviously not good. But I think the first ones were probably like League, right? That was I don't know, maybe you guys can think of an earlier example.
Yes, a little bit, you guys, right? So, like, that's one of the things I was curious about, because I think, as you said, Justin W., the infrastructure was not in place to, like, monetize IAPs online, right? You didn't have the payments infrastructure. It's remarkable to me Facebook didn't launch this as an integrated product immediately, right? They kind of missed the opportunity a little bit. And so there were these barriers to IAP monetization because you had to presumably do like VAT tax collections yourself, right? When you were taking payments. So you guys had to build the infrastructure in order to conduct like a microtransaction monetization model. But when you launched like Zynga Poker, for example, did you at the time launch it with IAPs like in 2008? Because that would precede League by about a year then.
No, we didn't launch it with IAPs. But it didn't take that long for us to get there. And you're right that Facebook didn't have a system for this, and they didn't have it until years later. So there was this really interesting period where Facebook didn't actually know how much revenue Zynga was making because we were processing our own payments. So this is way before any of this was happening. And by the way, everybody thought this thing didn't work because it only makes sense if you're the person buying the things, right? To everybody else, virtual goods seemed ridiculous. And back then, they were heretical. Like people in the games industry did not believe that people were actually spending money on these items. And the companies that knew they were, there was like Nexon and Zynga and a handful of other companies who were doing this. And you couldn't really get good information on how much money any of the companies were making. So I remember TechCrunch articles saying, you know, there's rumors that Zynga's making 10 million a year. We were making 100 million a year. And all the comments were saying there's no way they're making $1 million. Like that's how far off expectations were on what was actually going on. And so for a while it was like, you know, Peter Thiel says, like, you find a secret. The secret is people were very willing to pay for virtual goods. It wasn't as easy as people thought. You know, what followed was like this sort of gamification wave after Zynga's IPO where people thought, oh, it's simple. Like you just put IAPs in an app and badges and then retention is solved and revenue is solved forever. They really didn't appreciate like just how hard it was to build a context and an economy where people actually care about the things that you are offering to them. But yeah, I think it caught everybody by surprise. And now it's funny because I always go back to this when I think about Web3, which is there can be these activities that are like social contagions, or they rely a lot on social proof. And so there's something that can seem kind of crazy to everybody who's not doing it. And then once it happens with your friends, and once you're in that context, it just seems totally normal. And I think in many ways, like there are differences, but in many ways, Web3 has like a lot of the same properties today, where there are people who are really participating, they really get it, and they love it. And there's a lot of people standing on the outside who are just kind of scratching their heads.
I was just going to say that I think that when Facebook filed for their IPO, they disclosed the fact that in 2011, Zynga accounted for approximately 12% of their revenue from payment processing and ad sales, which is extraordinary that a single company accounted for, I think at one point, 15% of Facebook sales. And in many ways, I think this like preceded what emerged as the mobile business model that Apple then dominated, and Google, which is a combination of ad-based monetization for user acquisition and payment processing fees at 30% revenue, which has, powered the $120 billion in mobile games since. And so this was really the precedent to what emerged as the mobile game business.
I'm curious a little bit to go back into scaling on Facebook, and like there's a moment in time when like poker was working really well, and then you had to go or you went to multiple games, like how did that happen? And like, how did you decide what to do and scale Zynga so quickly?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one advantage that we had at Zynga that I think a lot of companies don't necessarily have is we figured out pretty quickly we wanted to be like a game studio, and that we wanted to scale horizontally with the products we did. And then we knew those had to be studios. And so when you think about like one of the hardest things to solve when you scale a company is what is the org, like what is the structure to go build a bigger company that gets more leverage. In Zynga, that was like pretty clear because we knew that we could scale the sort of accountability and the decision-making that anybody could do by having studios where people had a lot of autonomy. And then we knew we could share code across them, and we could share our analytics infrastructure and our payments infrastructure and all these other things. So you could almost think of it as like publishing, but it was almost all in-house. And at one point we got to, there were dozens of studios. We acquired dozens of companies. At that time, there were kind of like a lot of, the market was so different. You guys remember this back in 2010 or something. There were so many companies that were struggling to raise their next round that had amazing founders that then came into Zynga, and they became general managers of their own studio. So the way it started was you had these sort of all-in-one engineer product people that would run their own game with a very small team. The more profit they made, the more resources they would get. And people would move between teams sometimes, or they would hire new people into their studio. And like the different studios actually started to have pretty different cultures. And so one of the things that I thought was great about that is there were so many people in our company that actually built products from 0 to 1. And so they had a lot of help with, the infrastructure side, and the learnings, and a lot of these things were built into the product at launch. But they had the experience of taking something that had 0 users and actually growing it to a real user base. And in terms of what to build and how, we had to just put a list on the wall of like, here are the genres that are the biggest games that have ever existed over the last 30 years. Which one of these can be adapted to this Flash-based point-and-click, mom-and-pop social gaming model? Like, which one of these do we have conviction will be a crossover? And then, who are the people that can go take a stab at that? So I wouldn't say we were at the point where we had like these gaming studio GMs where they had complete license to go build like whatever they could dream up, because the industry wasn't in that space yet. It was very much a land grab. It was more like, and this is kind of interesting, Mark Skaggs was one of the GMs at Zynga, and he was on Command and Conquer Red Alert. He was the executive producer for that game at EA, so he's very famous for real-time strategy games. Brian Reynolds, also super famous executive producer for real-time strategy games. And then they came into Zynga and they built these simulation games. And it's kind of funny because the same people who were critiquing this traditional game, Command and Conquer and like Civilization, they were looking at Farmville and saying, I hate this. And the guys who built those games were literally their most favorite people. And what they realized is like Farmville and Cityville and Frontierville in these games are actually real-time strategy for your grandmother. They are the same thing. It's like point and tap and manage resources on a screen in a casual way. And so now we see so many of these farm games and everything, and we just think of them as like their own genre. But at the time, those games have a very clear lineage to real-time strategy. So when you ask about like, how do we figure out what games we're going to build? A lot of it was that. It was like, well, is there real-time strategy? That's a big game on PC right now. How would we do that? What would it look like? It has to be asynchronous. It can't be live. Like all these things, we would go through all the design challenges. We kind of see what we can get conviction on, and then we'd fund it. And we'd have a green light process to just make sure that the funding increased when we built conviction on the game. So we'd have a lot of bets going on. Things would get funded and defunded all the time. And then we would like be very able to reward these studios when they did something that really worked. So the nice thing about this is, it's more challenging, you're more accountable. The good thing is like when someone delivers a bunch of profit to the company, it's very easy to say that studio did that and like we should give everyone a bonus, right? Or like up their equity or whatever. And I think that's more challenging in some bigger companies today.
Yeah, there was a moment in time when in Silicon Valley when like everybody wanted to hire product people who came out of running Zynga studios and games. I think because you guys had like such a rigor around metrics and kind of optimizing based on and iterating based on metrics in real time. I remember that. And the other thing that came to mind is our co-founder Robin, who you worked with at Zynga. Robin always, I think you learned this probably from Zynga, but he always says that like when there's a new platform that comes out, it's all the existing genres that get ported to that platform. It's like people aren't creating like new games out of whole cloth, hardly ever,
I think what's really extraordinary about Zynga as a product company is it's unique among game developers in its actual portfolio. And you built a poker game first, right? Then you had Farmville, so you're already switching from casino to simulation there. At a point, you picked up Natural Motion, you made CSR, just like kind of a premium, quite AAA almost experience. Now Zynga has Peak in its portfolio, really top-notch developer. As you look at Zynga's portfolio, they have an incredible selection of now hyper-casual to puzzle casual simulation and casino. A lot of people have spoken about their kind of unique advantage in building an internal ad network, potentially, to funnel users across this portfolio environment. Like, I'm very interested how you guys managed to successfully build that portfolio, which like a lot of companies have tried to do but failed to realize any synergies between them. How were you able to maintain focus? What were the learnings you could transfer across those games? I'm interested in your product strategy.
Yeah, I mean, look, blood, sweat, and tears. Like the first, the early days of Zynga was just a grind. People working very hard and autonomy, accountability. Like we had amazing people. I think that was a time when you could go and roll up. We had something that was working from 2007 to 2010. There weren't that many companies that were in that situation. So you got to keep in mind, like when we IPO'd in 2011, we were the largest IPO since Google, and that was in 2004. That's 7 years. And then Facebook came like a month later and just, made that record go away immediately. And then there was Dropbox. It was like all kind of the same year where things started kicking off again. And then we had this run since then that, makes it all look quaint now. But, at the time it was just, it's hard to imagine how much different things were for people who weren't there. And I feel like, a lot of it comes down to the people. Like we were able to get so many talented people concentrated on this idea. And then it was winner takes most. So these were social games. And then we can talk about what happened later with mobile games. But with social games, you want to play them with your friends. And we started to realize like running these was a lot like running a bunch of small social networks, right? So if you had the biggest farming game, like people don't want to play the number 2 farming game. And when things moved to mobile and people stopped playing games with their friends for a number of other reasons, that kind of went away. Fragmentation became the norm. And so you're talking about a company, like we had something like 70% plus market share in a lot of these countries. And there's not a game company that's in that position anymore, including Zynga itself, because mobile games is highly fragmented with the way that it's distributed and the way people play. There are really not network effects on most of these games. So what I would say is we were early and then we leveraged our network effects. And we came from a background, like everybody, the founders of the company and the early employees of the company, we weren't gaming company people. We were like Silicon Valley startup social networking people. And then we were figuring out games and kind of reinventing them around those principles. And so, by the way, we shipped tons of stuff. Like, I don't know exactly what our success rate was with these games, but it was in the first year, once we realized, hey, there's a lot of interesting games we want to do. We didn't waste time saying like, we need to go build this $5 million, $10 million game. We were looking to validate everything very quickly and build a lot of cheap games and then experiment on top of the cheap games to understand like what the design should be for all these different genres. And like we had about one hit a year where we knocked it out of the park, and that's all it really took. So we had, Zynga Poker like got to over $100 million a year run rate, and that was a really big deal. And then Yoville did the same thing. That was our virtual world that had over 10 million DAU. So it was kind of like everybody was talking about Second Life, but we were running this game with 10 million daily users that was that had its own trading economy on Facebook and was making over 100 million a year. We had Mafia Wars was doing over 100 million a year. This is all before Farmville. So like this is before Farmville. We had 3 games doing over 100 million a year. So Farmville came and it was like the culmination of those learnings, right? And then Cityville came after Farmville. It was almost like the sequel. And so these games were like, we were taking people and moving them off from one studio to the next and like rolling the code, the analytics, the product, the people, and like just keeping it going and then kind of building and iterating on the existing businesses, but then having the opportunity to say, well, what if you could do it again? What would you do over? I'm sure like if you ask Justin about Twitch, what if you could just reset it and start it over each year, or every 6 months you could just have another team that rolls out a new version of Twitch. There are so many things you can do when you're starting over that you can't do when you're iterating on the product that customers have come to expect a certain set of functions for. So we got to experiment even faster in this model and just say like, hey, like try that over here, try this over here. If it works, suddenly it's not a big risk anymore. Now you can pull it right back into the old set of products. So this is a portfolio approach that early in a market, when the amount of investment that's required is lower to succeed, because the quality of the products is not that high yet, because no one believes in the market, it's possible to run this kind of playbook. So this is the type of playbook that could work in a space like Web3, where there are a bunch of very early games that people haven't really tried that much. It's not a type of strategy you can run in mobile games anymore, right? Like you need to have a much bigger investment or you can have something work.
I was just going to say, I definitely want to get to the shifts that happen later, but I'm very curious, when you look back at your kind of like product development progress at Zynga, I guess, how did you guys think about using the like unique social effect? Oh, sorry. How we were speaking with a developer that we're integrating with now, and they were saying they're very unfamiliar with this. Like, you deploy a product on web immediately, right? You can ship it every week. They're used to a version release timeline that's agreed, 2 months in advance. They'll ship an update. And I was thinking that is a fascinating mindset shift for developers, moving from the kind of like you push an update every 2-3 months. I guess what you're saying about your pace of iteration, was that enabled by the fact that you were distributing on web so you could ship updates very rapidly in a kind of continuous deployment model?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, in so many ways, Apple has broken the model here in the flywheel. And so yes, I mean, we were running A/B tests every day, right? Like any other web product company would, but I think the difference is with games, there's just so many dimensions that you can explore on, right? And so, and then you get that across all these products, like, because you can only ship, no matter how much you scale a team, you can only ship so many tests on a single product before you're worried about just breaking everything, because you can't even keep track of all the tests you're running, right? So it's really about, if you have a horizontal portfolio, you've got 10 active going games, and they're sort of all shipping what they think is best for their game, but they're also shipping a lot of different things that, if they work, then every week the product managers get together and they talk about what the most successful things were, and people just start cross-pollinating ideas. Like, you can just test an enormous amount of things, and on the web, I mean, there's no limitation to that, right? So for sure, yeah, I mean, it would never have been possible without the web.
Yeah, even A/B testing is very, very hard to do in native clients.
Well, let's talk about mobile now. So, Zynga made this transition from web to mobile. Facebook Was that kind of a push or pull in that? Was mobile like something that was emergent and you were like, oh, well, holy shit, we need to own this? Or was it Facebook becoming the more hostile environment to social apps and games? And,
I feel like, you never get to write the history of your company, but it's interesting. Once you're public, a lot of people, they research it and they have opinions. And in some ways, they understand parts of your business that like maybe you never even really gave much thought. But in other ways, like, these rumors have a way of just sort of traveling by themselves and getting repeated. So they become the lore. For us, like, we did have tense moments with Facebook, and in particular around credits. So you can imagine we're processing payments ourselves for years. And then Facebook was like, hey, that seems like a good business. Like, we want to do that. And you should suddenly, in order to be on our platform, you have to do that. And our natural response was like, okay, well, we can see why you'd want to do that. The problem is, like, we have 70% market share and we're just giving you all these credit cards for free so you can let other developers use these credit cards that we did the work to convert in the first place. And a number of other issues, like your platform is not as good at catching fraud as our platform because we've been doing it for years. And just the list goes on and on and on. So there was this a long period where we were saying like, hey, look, we will put your payments next to our payments. We'll run them in an actual test. And then when you guys can hit all the numbers that we hit, then maybe we talk about switching. And then there was a bunch of terms about how this relationship was going to go forward because we were on the terms of service, right? Our companies are about to IPO, both of ours. And our agreement is literally based on the terms of service. We had no special side letter or any special agreement between Zynga and Facebook. And then we were saying, okay, well, we have to sort this out. So it all sort of came to a point at one moment where people realized there was a lot of value, right? And now it's like, well, how are we going to work together? We've been trying to get ahead of this. I mean, we were one of the biggest spenders on Facebook's ad platform, in part because we were making a lot of money. And their ads weren't that great at that time, but we were making so much money that it just felt like a better idea to spend it in Facebook's ad channel than to not create more alignment with them because they didn't have credits at that time, right? So why not spend a bunch of money on Facebook ads was kind of one way we were looking at it for a while. And so when it finally came to a point, we did have like our showdown. I led a team where we built Zynga.com, which is like an alternative social platform and game network to actually go play these games. And we did have tens of millions of users that were now playing on Zynga.com in case Facebook ever shut off. So there's a whole other separate story here about like rebuilding a social network in 2010 to prevent the downside of a fallout with Facebook. But ultimately what happened on the traffic side, that it's funny that no one really expected this. So everyone was looking at analysts to say, what would happen if mobile usage continues to grow? We all believe it's going to grow. That's not a contrarian viewpoint, but what does it do to consumption? And in 2009, the email client on the iPhone barely worked. And people weren't really watching videos on their iPhone. This is like early days. People forget the games were primitive. We had big games in mobile like Mafia Wars they're text-based RPGs. Angry Birds was like the pinnacle of entertainment. And most of these other games, they were super simple. So people, they didn't see the use cases moving over from desktop to mobile yet. And so analysts were saying, hey, actually what's going to happen here is like mobile is going to add to the amount of time people spend a day computing and on the internet, but they're not really going to cannibalize that much. People are still going to sit down on their desktop for however much time they do each day. And there's going to be a whole category of things they do on their desktop. Then they're going to go to their mobile phone and they're going to do all this other stuff. And in 2009, most people actually agreed with this. And so people weren't that worried about cannibalization. And Facebook was slow to get their mobile app working on smartphones, actually. It took them a few years. They had an app out pretty quickly, but it had really bad performance problems and people hated it. And so their users were not moving over. They were not cannibalizing. They were still using the desktop product and they were reluctantly using the mobile product. And it took them a few years to fix it. And when they finally fixed it, people just started quitting the desktop version. And this was like the first moment where you saw, okay, wait a second, like there's a huge amount of cannibalization that's going to happen. And the problem for us is our games were on desktop, right? So it didn't matter how much Facebook and Zynga were aligned at that point. Like the users started
they didn't work in the mobile
mobile
browser.
And there was no app platform on mobile. And so naturally we started working with Facebook to make an app platform because for Facebook, e-commerce stuff like Shopify and everything hadn't blown up yet. So a lot of their ad revenue was us and other sort of game companies at that time and platform related companies. And so they wanted to make a platform. So they put together a platform. It was called Project Spartan. You know, what you could do on the mobile web at that point was very simple. There was no Flash. Steve Jobs killed it. And TechCrunch put out this article that said Spartan is going to kill the App Store. I can't remember what year this is, but immediately Apple just bans them. So it's immediately Apple just literally is like, no, you're not going to do that at all. We're just going to shut it off. And that was when you realize, oh, wow, okay. Like, this is interesting. You know, how long is this going to play out? And so we've seen this stuff work in other places like China with WeChat, and the mini apps platform is huge. But outside of China, wow, okay. Like that's a change we've been waiting on for 12, 13 years since that happened. And now, like just now is the regulatory change on this stuff. So it's been really interesting to see how all that played out.
This is awesome to hear because it's so dominant now that it's like easy to think that this was always how the mobile games ecosystem was going to evolve, but like it sounds like it could have gone differently, right? Like if you guys, so I'm curious why you decided to agree to give Facebook 30%, for example, when you could have launched a direct channel. And then similarly, I guess with mobile, you probably were more forced to move there because that's where users were engaging. But yeah, I'm interested how it could have gone differently, why you made the decisions to go with the intermediaries that you did.
Yeah, so a few questions there. One about mobile. Some people felt like we underinvested in mobile. I think we had more people on mobile than any other company by a factor of 10. So we had so much money at that time. Like we had a couple hundred person mobile game studio when in the first year of mobile, and we had some of the top grossing games right away. The problem was mobile was small. Everybody knew it was going to be big. Nobody knew it was going to be as big as it has become. No one was expecting $100 some odd billion of freemium revenue 12 years out, but everyone knew it was going to be big, and everyone knew that it was going to be bigger than desktop at some point. So we were investing everything in mobile that we could possibly justify. The problem was we're about to IPO, and you've got this 200 to 300 person studio, and even if you're killing it on mobile, you're making like a few $1 million a year, and then your other game studios are making over $1 billion a year. So like it's just typical innovator's dilemma where it doesn't matter how much you can justify it from a future looking perspective. Like it looks like such a tricky investment in the near term. And so we did that. But how do you staff it with your best people when they're busy printing money on the other side of the business? It was like a whole thing. And to your earlier point about like how we eventually got those other great studios like Peak and others, a big part of it was because we were pretty conservative with our cash. And I think that a lot of other companies were not at that time. And we dodged some bullets. Like there are companies that we almost bought that we didn't, that if we did, would have been a bet the company sort of moment. And we wouldn't have had the money to go buy a Peak, you know, very late in the game. And so the second sort of wave for Zynga was about amazing corp dev. The first wave was about really strong product management and figure out the right products to build, and a lot of acqui-hires where we got amazing teams to get together to go build those products. And the second wave was having all this cash from the good times to go and buy the teams that succeeded in mobile later. And so that's not to say that Zynga didn't do a lot of good things like in-house. You know, we had Words with Friends. It was the biggest game on mobile for years early on. And we bought that team, but they were small when we bought them. It's basically the same. The way you can think about it is like the Instagram acquisition for Facebook. It's like, it was clearly taking off, but like the magnitude of outcome was 100x or 1000x because of the acquisition. We took something and just threw rocket fuel on it. So yeah, it's kind of a mix of these things.
And Zynga definitely was disciplined with their cash. You say, like, I think Peak was bought at 1.8 billion, which I think was a 2.7 price to sales ratio, which is pretty damn good. And that was kind of mid 2020 at the height. So that was a reasonably disciplined acquisition. I remember when that sale was happening because we'd invested in Dream Games, a bunch of ex-Peak developers that had gone on. And so, yeah, people don't realize how much of a cash business mobile is, right? It's almost got the economics of like a commodity trading business in that it has very tight unit economics, both in user acquisition. So the other thing I wanted to ask about is you obviously benefited from Facebook's social features, notoriously like the poke feature, right? And then those were deprecated. And so I do think Facebook somewhat lost the games opportunity, and seems to have really lent into, I think, what got it in trouble a few years later of like political content, and they probably could have lent more heavily on games and apps like Apple's model did. So could you talk a bit about like the organic social discovery and user acquisition you benefited from Facebook? What happened with those features when they were shut down?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually very mutual at the time. So keep in mind, 2007, when we started building games, it was just college users, actually. It wasn't even available outside of university. It's kind of hard to imagine. So there's this huge wave of growth that happened. And one of the best ways to solve the cold start problem, it turns out, is to give people things to do before their friends join, right? Which happens to be what games are probably the best possible thing that Facebook could ever have happen to them. So there were all these up and coming countries that were joining Facebook. And I'm not going to say we were responsible for most of their user growth, but there were countries coming online where we would look at like the social graph in those countries, and they were not seeing the connectedness that the Americans came on with, where everybody came on through a friend. They were coming on and they were just literally playing games together. They were like, they weren't gamers in the sense that they're someone who identified as a gamer and came to Facebook to go play games. But when they got there, they just didn't have enough to do. So they were just spending all their time playing games. We saw this in a lot of these countries that were coming online over that main growth period for Facebook. And so, yeah, I mean, we certainly benefited from a lot of their channels. And then I think Facebook also benefited tremendously from having these apps. Like, not clear to me that they could have grown like that through all these regions without having these things for people to do, because a lot of these other countries did not come online with the hyper oversharing sort of demographics of college students. They just came online in a very different sort of pattern. And so as those channels changed, and Facebook was doing a pretty good job of managing them, and they're trying to like make it so they weren't getting burnt out. And there's a tragedy of the commons. Like, you have this public resource with these APIs, and how do you make sure that the feed channel stays sort of good for people to use for as long as possible, and the request channel and these other things. And they tried a lot of things. They tried a lot of things to measure the response rates and, like the click-through rates and things like this to make sure that the relevancy was there. And the real story is like, we leaned into those things. So it is true that like the volume of sort of usage that we had in our games in these channels was crazy. And so people felt like, wow, you guys just overwhelmed the channels. But the reason we got to the volume of usage on the channels is because the things that people were doing with each other were relevant, and they were clicking them and they were using them. And so there was this virtuous cycle of sending more and more, and the user base got big. So yes, there's going to be a lot of lonely cow posts in your feed. But you couldn't just go and make a Facebook app and say, post 10 million posts in the feed and just have it grow. So there's this sort of like lack of detailed understanding of what happened there, where people are just like, oh yeah, you just came in and you just set the dial to 100 and then like the game just grows. And that's not really like what happened. It was always trying to figure out like, how do you make these actions socially interesting and relevant? And then that's how we were aligned. That's how we were aligned with Facebook. So I felt like we used to call it real social. So we had this whole movement inside the company where like we were pushing back against anything. If it's not real social, we don't want to do it. The whole company is about how do you make games where people can spend time with each other, with people they care about. So like Words of Friends, this is about, you want to play a game with your grandmother because you don't have anything to talk about, right? Like, you want to keep in touch with her, but you don't have something to say every day. Now you have Words with Friends, and you can play every day, and then you can chat when you feel like it. But you just get this feeling of always having a line open with that person, and that's really powerful. Like, that's what built the company. So, I think it's less of a story about the channels and more about like how you use them.
Yeah, how you tie product innovation to distribution dynamics. Super interesting. I think that I'm very interested in like the shift to mobile's impact on social gameplay, because as you said, like these things were so dominant socially. I remember that moment in time when like everyone's playing Conville, you're getting tons of notifications, and then you get mobile, which is very superficially social. I was speaking with the founders of Jelly Button today. I don't know if you know that studio, but they, similar to you guys, like blew up on Facebook, but then really made it big on mobile. But their big innovation was bringing kind of raid mechanics of attacking someone else's base to kind of casino gameplay. But that is very kind of superficial social gameplay, right? It's just basically attacking someone whose picture attacking their base. And it was, I think, more authentically social back then than it is now, where a lot of these characters are like fake profiles with images who don't exist. I think you really have seen a decline of truly social gameplay because of the fragmentation of mobile. So yeah, interested in your view of when the mobile shift happened, what happened to social gameplay?
Yeah, it's true. So, and this is it wasn't one actor that was responsible for this, but it's true. We're mostly playing mobile games alone. So what the hell happened, right? We went from everybody playing games together. Like I would go into Farmville and there'd be 80 people that I knew. At one point, 40 million people were playing this game a day, back when there were so many fewer people online. 80% of Facebook's DAU at one point, just one game, Farmville. So what happened? It's a number of things, but the biggest thing on mobile, the games are distributed through ads. They're not distributed through social channels. And there's a few different reasons they're not distributed through social channels. One of which is, well, back to that story about Facebook and Project Spartan, which was to put the mobile sort of game business or game platform on Facebook. Apple has disallowed developers from monetizing inside of a mini apps ecosystem for the entirety of its run in here. And that just recently got changed about a month or two ago with all the sort of new regulatory scrutiny that Apple's been going through. And people barely noticed. But if you wonder, why did that happen in China and nowhere else? It's because in China, they didn't have the control over the ecosystem that they had in other places. And now that's true everywhere. And so there was a period in time where people got really excited about HTML5 and it like wasn't ready to do games that you could do on native app stores. And so, way back in 2009, people were like, hey, we're going to build it in HTML5. Let's go make these games. And it didn't work, right? So like the tech did not work. But then 4 or 5 years later, it pretty much did work. But the business model didn't, because you couldn't monetize inside these other platforms. And because you couldn't monetize, the platforms couldn't make money. And because the platforms couldn't make money, they never really spent that much time trying to build these platforms into something great. So they're all looking at this WeChat thing and they're like, this is amazing. We want to do something like that, but Apple won't let us. And so sometimes they would kind of get to the edge of building everything that they wanted to build, only to realize that in one moment, Apple could just shut the whole thing down. And so they never really got conviction to go build all of it. And I think this for Apple comes down to switching costs. So if you think about it this way, like until recently with TikTok popping up on the scene, Facebook, when you use your iPhone, you're using an Apple device and it has iOS, but you're spending almost all of your time inside of a Meta-owned property. Like at some point for a lot of users, probably 80% of their time on this piece of glass is in Facebook's products, not on Apple's products. And so Apple may own the OS, but Facebook owns the user experience. Facebook owns the engagement. And so if you think about it, like, of course, Facebook is the biggest distribution channel for games. Of course, their ad ecosystem is where everybody discovers a game. That's where people spend their time. Now, if the games were built into their platform and they could monetize, who would bother with the App Store? And when it came to switching to a new phone, and all your games just went with you, and you were connected to all those friends on Instagram or Facebook or WhatsApp, then why would you really care which phone you bought? Because you're spending 80% of your time inside of a Meta property, and all the apps just move with it. And so this app ecosystem that has created a lot of lock-in for Apple, it's about more than payments, right? It's their differentiation. These phones have just become a piece of glass, and the OS has become more and more similar, and there's more and more overlap with Unity about what's available in each store. But the switching costs, if these games live inside these social platforms, is a huge problem for them. So they've fought it at every step of the way. It's finally over. And how this is related to social games is basically, if I'm buying ad users from ads, I need to buy users that will spend money in my game to make money back from the ad spend, right? And so it all became about targeting. But one of the things Gabe Layden figured out, the founder of Machine Zone, before everybody else, was, hey, wait a second. Zynga is trying to build all these mass market games on mobile like they did on desktop social networks. And the mass market games were the best way to do with social gaming because you want all of your friends to be able to play it. If we make a game that 9 out of 10 of your friends aren't interested in, and you send 10 invites, well, then that game is not going to be very successful as a social game, right? It has to be something that almost any of your friends would play with you. Now, with ads, it's like completely different. You want to find the exact person who's going to play the exact game you're advertising to them. And if you advertise to anybody else, it's a huge problem. And one way that you get cheaper ad buys is by focusing on niche that other people aren't focusing on, which over time makes those niches smaller and smaller because people focus on many of the big ones already. So you get this extreme fragmentation where the way that you make a game is you go find a way to advertise to some group of people that no one's advertising to yet, and you make a game that exactly those people want. And most of their friends don't want it. And you're not willing to buy ads for their friends to come in because they're not going to be profitable on like a CAC LTV basis. And so there's literally an economic reason that people make games that you can't play with your friends anymore. And it's because it's not profitable with the way distribution happens on the mobile app store. And so the question for us at Playco and why we started the company was like, well, what if we could build these platforms again on the mobile messengers? And we worked closely with them to solve these problems. And on the regulatory side, to get movement from Apple to enable mini app ecosystems outside of China.
Yeah, and this is what's just transformed over the last few years, I think, for a number of reasons. Like, one, because mobile's not growing like it was. Two, massively because of the deprecation of IDFA, right? So what you described about targeting happening at the ad layer, where you find your specific user that's going to spend X amount on your game, it's not viable anymore because you don't have the IDFA to attribute that install, target that user. So you're seeing a reinvestment in these organic mass market social discovery tools like chat distributed apps. So yeah, very curious about your view on maybe what's changed, what's promoting this reinvestment in broader organic targeting.
Yeah, a few things. So first was there were some high profile IPOs during COVID around games that made VCs excited again, right? So we had people like Jay Chi and Makers Fund and others who built these big game funds a while ago, and they were there weren't a lot of people focused on it. Like VCs were not interested in game companies. And then suddenly we saw Roblox and these other services come up, and we saw Epic have Unreal 5 come out, and everybody was just wowed by Fortnite and their engine, right? And everyone was like, wow, these look like venture businesses. Maybe we should start investing in game companies. Now it's kind of tricky because like Roblox is a 20-year-old company. And it's not really like, it is like a VC success story, but I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't know if it would make it through today's environment, like with how lean they ran and the period that they ran through. Like, I'm not sure that they would be able to start that company today and get the 10 years that they needed to get to, traction. So, and then we have companies like Epic, which, I mean, Tim Sweeney's been building that company for even longer, right? So it's interesting. People are interested in these outcomes that actually took 20, 30, 40 years to get to. And they're like, boom, go do it in 2 years, right? Now there's validation that this works. So despite that, so like there's a new VC interest starting probably about 4 years ago during COVID. That also meant that big companies started getting interested again. So, Facebook's like, wait a second, if most of our ad revenue comes from games, like maybe we should be building a better game platform, right? Maybe instant games should actually be a part of this. If people are spending more time inside and they're playing more games, maybe we should have games. So Netflix comes out with, focus on games. We had Zoom put out a game platform that hasn't quite been ever fully rolled out. We had every single large market cap tech company that was touching consumers suddenly wanted to do game stuff and wanted to build a platform. So we started working with a lot of them, and we're just like, hey, we're the guinea pig. Like, we'll build APIs with you. We'll help you figure out like what kind of design you want to do. We'll be early. Like, we're used to it. When things are broken, we'll figure it out. So that started happening again. And then there was still this missing piece around monetization. Like at Playco, we were willing to say, hey, look, Apple still shut off monetization for this. This is a huge problem. Maybe we can find some simple ways of working around it in the meantime. We're not going to be making as much money as we would if it was fixed, but we believe in this so much that we want to get ahead of it. And then we want to work toward educating people about what the problems are so that someday, this will get fixed. And so it recently did get fixed. And it hasn't really like caught the attention of most people yet, but it's allowed to monetize mini app ecosystems inside of these platforms now. And so we can expect that like that single change in the terms of service agreement between these developers and Apple means that suddenly like there's actually a business case to go fund these things. in a way that actually contributes to the business. And so, I think that all these things combined, like to your point about IDFA and game developers seeing that, the sort of tried and true targeting model started to not really work anymore, means that people are experimenting. They're finally like looking outside of the app store to try to figure out the best way to grow their games. And I think people have been, overall, companies have just not been focused enough on the web. Like it's so capable now in terms of the games you can build directly in it, and the sort of distribution and monetization that you can drive. And we're going to see a lot of experimentation over the next few years.
Have you seen, are the mobile app platform, or sorry, big mobile apps, so like Instagram or Facebook or on mobile, for example, starting to open up to instant games? Or like where are you guys finding traction, or what platforms are you focused on?
Yeah, so we've been working with Facebook since the founding of the company, and Facebook Messenger has had an instant games platform for about 4 years or so now, or longer in some forms. They've kind of evolved it over time. And it's always been a question of like, how do these things interoperate? And Facebook's done a lot to increase the interoperability between Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp, right? So, I mean, like to me, it's an inevitability. I can't speak to Facebook's plans, but if you think about it, like if once they have it working as a business somewhere and they're making enough money from it, then like naturally they'd try to find a way to bring it to all of their properties, right? So I would love to do more games on Instagram.
And before we started, you were talking a lot about Telegram, which is, I think there's a lot of smart Silicon Valley money focused on Telegram as a platform and ton as a monetization mechanism. So I'm curious, like what your views are on like building for Telegram.
Yeah, I think Telegram, the team is so good. It's like insane. It's kind of crazy. Yeah, and if you think about it, like the APIs that they've released are they're just good. And they're firing on all cylinders. The app, it's such a small team relative to a lot of other in the world. Products.
The best mobile product team in the world. Like 50, they're less than 50 people.
Yep. I objectively and qualitatively, like I just feel like they're the best product team in the world right now. Like if you measure the number of users and engagement and growth, and you look at the product and just talk about how it feels, even from a design perspective, I just think they're the best. And they're doing it with far fewer people. And I think that's why they're succeeding. I think they've been extremely selective with how they built the team. And I think they don't have the sort of struggles of a larger company that has to work through, decision-making with a bunch of people. And they have built APIs that reflect that. Like their APIs are just good. We've worked on 10 different messaging platforms, and I worked on 10 different social networking platforms back in the desktop social days. Like Telegram has the best APIs I've seen. The team that's running it, they've done it before. Like the founder he's ex VK, which was a Facebook clone in Russia, and that was 17 years ago. And then they cloned the Facebook platform, and he ran his own Russian sort of version of the Facebook platform on the other side of the world with a bunch of different developers. And at Zynga, we were thinking about participating in their platform back then, and we did release a thing or two. So these people have been doing it for a long time. Like this isn't a story of some whiz kid figuring out how to build a messaging app. This is a team of extremely talented people who've been doing this for almost 20 years. So I think that's like just the context I'd set, because what I often hear in the US is people are like, oh, this Telegram thing's from Russia, and like I don't really get it and must be a scam. It's over 1 billion users. It started in a lot of countries that like are not the highest sort of value users in terms of revenue. But at this point, it's expanded a lot into many different parts of the world. The user experience is rivaling or better than most of the apps, and the growth is faster. The APIs are better, and they're one of the few companies that even before Apple was willing to change its policies through regulatory pressure to support this stuff, they basically just went all in on it. And they found a way with crypto to go around a lot of these limitations, and it took them a long time. They put out a token years ago. They got in an SEC lawsuit. They had to settle it. It was like this huge thing that, all these other projects just die. And then years later, they're still working on it, and it's like finally starting to bear fruit. It's a really amazing story. And like, if it works, they're years ahead of everybody else. And like it's a really, so now we're starting to see it work. We're starting to see some games grow on Telegram very quickly, and proving out this thesis around like distribution inside messengers and games that can be played without a download instantly with friends or with groups in Telegram and your sort of communities that you're a part of. And yeah, we released our own app that's our Web3 gaming platform inside of Telegram, and we're super excited about it.
Can you talk a little bit about the distinction between building instant games for Telegram that maybe monetize more classically versus how you're thinking about Web3, a Web3 gaming platform on Telegram?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty early to know. And one of the things that's so interesting about Telegram's platform is it's very crypto native, right? So Telegram has been a favorite platform of a lot of crypto sort of users for a while now. And they built their APIs around their mini app platform, assuming that a lot of people would end up using their crypto wallet to make transactions on this platform. Now, the hard part about that is you need liquidity. And a lot of people's liquidity in crypto sits on other chains. And so Ton as an ecosystem or as a token may have gone up a lot in value, but how many of these billion plus Telegram users actually have a Telegram wallet with crypto in it where it's funded? And how are they going to fund that wallet so that they can use it inside the games that people make, right? That's a big question. So it turns out that what has worked on the crypto side is to just sort of ignore that, right? Like, don't require that people have to connect their wallet and use crypto. Let them just play the game. And for some of these games, like there may be eventually like an airdrop based on the way people played the game. And in that way, like they have sort of some of the magic of crypto where the users will eventually get some token, but they don't have the sort of funnel issues of blocking people who don't yet have crypto in their wallet. And so they're onboarding this massive group of users and educating them about what crypto is along the way. So there was a game called Notcoin that came out around December or something at this point. And they saw a tremendous growth on Telegram. They got to, I believe, like 40 million users. And then they, at the end of the game, they sort of like cut it short. They said, hey, now we're going to airdrop people tokens based on whatever your position was in the leaderboard and some other formula. And they released a token and they gave more than 80% of the supply to the people who played the game. And now that token's out and it's at almost a $2 billion market cap. And almost all of the supply is held by these players. And so this is very different than like the Web3 stuff we saw a year or two ago where it's all whale controlled. And it's like, okay, for NFTs, you need somebody who's going to ape into your collection and spend a lot of money. This is something like 11 million users claimed this airdrop out of the 40 million who played. And they're just all over the spectrum, right? And a lot of them are new crypto users. So over time, if you see more developers doing that, well, then suddenly all these ton wallets are getting funded. It's a lot like the Ethereum story over the last 4 or 5 years where airdrop from all these different platforms. And then suddenly like a bunch of these Ethereum wallets have tokens and they didn't have to KYC or go through any of like the sort of, crazy things you have to do when you want to like use fiat to get money in crypto. And so I think what's interesting on the crypto side is that if they can have another 10 Notcoins before the end of the year, well, then suddenly maybe there's 100 million plus funded wallets on Telegram. What does that mean? Like, what does it mean if there's 100 million funded consumer crypto wallets inside this app platform where people grow their apps that quickly before the end of the year? I think that starts to look like a WeChat, like a mini app ecosystem that's just an incredibly interesting ecosystem with amount of crypto consumer wallet loaded users. Like that's nothing like anything we've seen in crypto so far. So I think the crypto part is a huge part of the story, but separately, they've also launched a way to do fiat payments since Apple changed the rules. And so Apple changed the rules about a month or two ago, and Telegram was the first sort of major app platform to just come out and say, boom, we're doing stars. You can buy stars with a credit card, and they've allowed users to use those stars in some ways that actually interact with crypto. So the really interesting thing here is like they can avoid some of the friction that's associated with crypto by letting a user use Apple Pay to buy some stars, that then the stars are used to maybe like go spend money on to a company that then goes and mints something on your behalf, that then just airdrops it into your wallet, and suddenly like you never KYC'd and you did a crypto thing where the company was compensated for whatever gas or whatever happened in between. So I think when you start to combine these pieces, it's I think they've solved the onboarding problem, and like we're just seeing the beginnings of the impact of that.
The onboarding problem is interesting. Like the airdrops are like Notcoin, what Notcoin did, super interesting. But and certainly it has a much larger impact than a lot of the like NFT things where it's reaching like a much broader base of users. But it still has some of the same problems potentially, which is like you not only the initial interest, but like ongoing liquidity for like the token, right? Like one of the things that happens in crypto projects a lot, and I think it like ongoing interest in the token and community or project is actually the exception, right? And like a lot of these projects actually have this huge spike, and then like there's no liquidity after people realize that there's no reason to continue like valuing or transacting in this in the coin. So I'm wondering if there's anything different about the Telegram ecosystem in that latter, in terms of like continuing to create utility or like some reason to hold these coins or like transact in them.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I can't speak for Notcoin. I think they have plans to build a game ecosystem with their coin. But I think what's interesting is like that's not necessarily Telegram's problem, right? So they could have hundreds of apps that do these airdrops, and if 5 of them figure out a way to actually do something interesting with their tokens, then maybe that's enough. That's kind of the story of Ethereum, right? So really, it's about becoming a platform, and I think they offer something that none of the other L2s have really offered up to this point, which is real distribution to real users that aren't like the same users going back and forth and farming the same token drops every time. So I think I'm with you. Like there's some really big question marks. Like people haven't solved the model, but we've figured out a model that's more viable than what we saw with play to earn with Axie, right? So I think what happened with Axie was amazing. Like we figured out you can drive a bunch of users to this resource, and the more people that play, the more people want that resource, the price goes up, people make money. The problem with it was never mass market. Like the idea that you had to buy this few $100 thing to play the game, that's why it worked so well. That's why the price and demand went up so much. But we always knew that it couldn't be maintained at those levels because it's too high of a price of entry for people. So when I think about what we learned with freemium games, it's, you need to keep the barrier to entry as low as possible. And like, if you can figure out a way where the game is playable for free, and then at the end of it, people get some unknown amount of money, it might not be a lot of money. And like, I think a lot of the typical crypto Twitter people who are looking for these big Uniswap like airdrops where they make generational wealth or whatever they're calling it now, they're probably not going to find it by playing a game on Telegram. But then there's this whole other set of people who are like, hey, you know what? Like I'm playing a free game. It's fun. And at the end of it, in a few months, maybe I'll make some money. And maybe I won't. And I have no idea how much it'll be. And, some of the devs aren't going to promise me anything, but I could just go on the App Store and play another game where I know that won't happen, or I can go do it here and it might. And that's actually a pretty interesting new dynamic here. So I'm with you. Like, I hope it stays sustainable, right? I guess nothing ever does, but I think, the next few months will be really interesting.
Cool. Well, we're just about hitting time. I want to be respectful of your time. And you've been super generous and join us for it. We have a final question that we always ask. We call our podcast Secret Stash. So we always ask someone to share a secret if there's like any, thing you haven't said publicly about the early days of Zynga or any of your other companies, or maybe something you've learned from investing that you'd share with our audience.
Secrets. Well, for me, like one of the most interesting insights we had at Zynga actually was around the virtual good economy. Like I said, I think, and I don't believe in like original ideas. I think everybody's just remixing the stuff they've experienced when they grew up and whatever they've had the sort of chance to experience as they go through their life. And I think that people should be, less ashamed of that. Like, because I think there are a lot of industries where where people actually just more publicly acknowledge that. Like, you know, what is music theory other than like a pattern of sounds that we've figured out that sound good together? And we have the same thing in everything we do. And our tendency is to want to do something that's like so unique that it couldn't have existed without us. But I think that the reality is what I've seen, like when somebody goes and builds something that a lot of people want, it's almost something that the world was just ready for. And you were finally the people to go and do it. And so, you know, I remember playing, you mentioned like Ultima Online in these earlier games. When I was younger, I spent a lot of time playing this game, Habbo Hotel, which is just, it's so interesting because it was way ahead of its time. And what a lot of people don't know is like, Habbo Hotel was built with Shockwave. And so there was still, it wasn't Flash, and you had to, Shockwave was like one step more annoying, where you had to go and get this plugin and it didn't quite work most of the time. And this company was like out somewhere in Europe, just comfortably making like millions of dollars through a virtual goods economy before almost any other web-based browser game company was doing it. They were doing it before Zynga, a few years before. And I remember I played that game a bunch growing up, and I realized like we could do a virtual world that was just much bigger, right? And we could take a lot of these concepts, and I just, it's not really a secret, but like it was out in the open, right? There were a lot of people that could see this happening. And I think this is how a lot of these secrets actually work, where it's not like there's one or two people that know it. It's like there's something there, and you could look at it and you can kind of believe in it, and you can extrapolate it, and you can say, well, what if that was everywhere? And so I still have like a ton of respect for that company. I think it was called Sulake or something. And you know, like one secret for us was like some of this playbook was written, and it wasn't we figured out everything ourselves. Even though we did a lot to popularize it and sort of grow it and expand upon it, there were companies that were starting to figure this out, and people just weren't paying attention. So biggest takeaway I have is there's always something like that, right? And always trying to find, you know, what is the next one of those? Like where is the future happening, and people just don't realize it yet.
I love that.
Is this Sulake, the Finnish dev?
Yeah, they're from Finland, and apparently they released an NFT collection in 2021.
Yeah, they're always on the bleeding edge. Yeah, I can't believe they're still around.
Justin, thank you so much for joining us. That was awesome.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.